Hey everyone, it's Jeremy Parish, and I'm here. I've taken over limited run retail to sell you something, except you can't actually buy this book at retail right now because it's only for pre-orders at the moment. It's the NES Era Volume 2, the amazing follow-up to the NES Era Volume 1. Now, the first volume of the NES Era was actually more about the Famicom era in Japan, but the NES Era Volume 2, NES and the Console Revolution, actually does take us into the American launch of the NES and the following years. It takes us all the way through the end of 1987. And you may be thinking, but Jeremy, you've already published books called NES Works about that era of the NES, and that's true, but that's not what the NES era is actually all about. Don't let the title mislead you. This is actually about all the video games in this era. You know your video game history. You know that in the early 80s, Atari had a massive crash, and it took out video games with it. But that's not actually true. It took out the American console industry. And the NES came in a couple of years later and kind of revitalized it. But that's really a simplification of how it worked. The reality is that video games didn't go away. They were just hard to find at retail. But Atari was still out there. Intellivision was still out there. Well, Mattel, eventually Sega, ready and waiting in the wings with all kinds of video games. If you are old enough, like me, to remember living during the era when the NES came to the US for the first time, you would go to the store and it wasn't a given that you were going to buy the NES. Maybe you were going to buy the Atari 7800, which was a really impressive system that got held over and then launched in 1986 once the NES launched. Or maybe you were going to go with the Sega side, with all those grid Master System boxes. They looked a little monotonous on the wall, but the games themselves were actually more impressive looking than the NES. It wasn't a given that the NES and Nintendo were going to become the dominant paradigm of American console games back then. And this book, the NES Era, Volume 2, NES and the Console Revolution, digs into that period of history and looks at what all was out there. It includes photography, screenshots, and text about every single game released in the US for consoles between October 1985 and December 1987, 2 years worth of games, and the NES was only a tiny fraction of that. You had the NES, you had the Sega Master System, you had the Atari 7800, but you also had the Atari 2600 being held over. You also had the Atari 5200 being held over, just a little bit. And then Atari launched another system called the XE Game System to make it even more confusing. 4 different Atari systems for you to choose from, and that's just Atari. And then you also had Mattel and its Intellivision, which actually had quite a resurgence in the late 80s. So that's what the NES Era Volume 2 encompasses. This specific slice of video game history, this period of time, and every game that was released for consoles here in the US. It wasn't just the NES, it wasn't just Nintendo. So that's the NES Era, Volume 2, NES and the Console Revolution, available for pre-order from limited run games. And of course, if you pick up a copy of the NES Era Volume 2, you'll get a $5 off coupon for the NES Era Volume 3. See how we're doing that? Just, first time's free kind of thing? Except not, it's actually $64.99.